Marcus Williams stood in the dim dawn light outside Meridian Construction Company, his hands trembling, not from the cold but from the weight of what he was about to do. And as he stared at the worn steel gates his father had built from nothing, 23 years ago, the same year Marcus was born, he knew that the next month would either confirm his worst assumptions about the people who worked here, or completely shatter everything he believed about what his family had built. The gravel crunched beneath his boots, cheap ones he'd bought yesterday, so different from the Italian leather loafers collecting dust in his downtown penthouse. And for the first time in his privileged life, Marcus felt invisible, stripped of the armor that his last name had always provided. His father, Jonathan Williams, was a legend in this city, a self-made black man who'd risen from laying bricks with his bare hands to owning the largest construction firm in 3 states. A man whose face graced magazine covers and whose name opened every door. But Marcus had spent the last 5 years watching from his corner office as resentment built in his chest like floodwater behind a dam, convinced that the employees who smiled at company events and cashed their paychecks were the same ones who mocked his father behind closed doors, who whispered that Jonathan's success was luck or something worse. And now Marcus was here to prove it, to expose them, to finally have justification for the anger he'd nursed since overhearing a conversation at a construction conference 2 months ago, where men who didn't know he was Jonathan's son had made cruel jokes about diversity hires, running companies now. The gate creaked open, and workers began trickling in, men and women in hard hats, carrying lunch pails, their faces etched with the kind of exhaustion that comes from years of physical labor. And Marcus pulled his borrowed cap lower, his fake resume folded in his pocket, his real identity buried deep. He'd used his mother's maiden name, Marcus Jensen, and had called in a favor from his college roommate, who worked in HR, to slip his application into the pile, making sure it never crossed his father's desk. And now here he was, about to spend 4 weeks as an entry-level laborer, watching, listening, gathering evidence of the disrespect he was certain festered beneath the surface. The site supervisor, a barrel-chested man named Dale, with sun-weathered skin and kind eyes that crinkled at the corners, looked Marcus up and down with the assessing gaze of someone who'd seen 1,000 young men come and go. "You, Marcus Jensen?" Dale asked, his voice gravelly but not unkind, and when Marcus nodded, Dale extended a calloused hand that swallowed Marcus's softer hands that had signed contracts but never mixed concrete, that had pointed at blueprints but never carried steel beams. "Welcome to the crew. Works hard, hours are long, but we take care of our own here. Mr. Williams built this company on respect, and that's what we give and what we expect. You show up on time, pull your weight, and you'll do fine." Something in Dale's voice, when he mentioned Jonathan, made Marcus's jaw tighten. Was it sarcasm, mockery, disguised as reverence? But Dale's expression revealed nothing but genuine warmth as he led Marcus to the crew gathering near a half-constructed building that would become a community center in the city's struggling east side, a project his father had taken on at cost because, as Jonathan had told the board over Marcus's objections, profit isn't the only measure of success, son. Marcus had rolled his eyes then, seeing it as performative charity. But now, standing among the workers, he felt the first flutter of something uncomfortable, something that might have been shame if he'd allowed himself to name it. The crew was diverse: black, white, Latino, Asian, young and old, men and women, and, as Dale introduced the new guy, Marcus watched their reactions with the suspicious eyes of someone looking for ammunition. There was Tommy, a young Latino man, probably Marcus's age, with an easy smile and paint-stained hands, who immediately stepped forward with a friendly welcome aboard. Brother, and Rosa, a black woman in her 50s, whose arms were roped with muscle and whose eyes held the sharp intelligence of someone who missed nothing. And Chen, a quiet Chinese immigrant whose English was broken but whose craftsmanship, Dale explained with obvious pride, was the finest on any site. "That's Jake over there," Dale said, nodding toward a white man in his 40s who leaned against a truck with his arms crossed. His mouth set in a hard line, and when Jake's eyes met Marcus's, there was no warmth, only a cold assessment that sent a chill down Marcus's spine. Jake's been here 15 years, knows every inch of this operation, Dale continued, either not noticing or choosing to ignore the tension radiating from Jake's direction. And Marcus filed it away here. Perhaps, was the prejudice he'd come to find. The first day was brutal in ways Marcus hadn't anticipated. His gym-toned muscles, built for aesthetics on expensive equipment, proved useless against the relentless demands of carrying cinder blocks, digging foundation trenches, and hauling debris under the merciless sun that turned his borrowed work clothes into a second skin of sweat. By lunch, his hands were blistered, his back screamed, and his pride was thoroughly demolished. But what struck him more than the physical pain was the kindness that surrounded him. Tommy, sharing his wife's homemade tamales. When Marcus's sad gas station sandwich fell in the dirt, Rosa showing him the right way to lift without destroying his spine. Chen nodding encouragement when Marcus finally got a technique right after a dozen failed attempts. First week's always the hardest, Rosa said during their afternoon break, handing Marcus a bottle of cold water from her personal cooler, her voice carrying the warmth of someone who'd mentored countless newcomers. But you got good instincts. You listen. That matters more than strength. Marcus mumbled his thanks, confused by the genuine care in her voice. By the way, the crew Jake excluded had folded him into their rhythm with barely a question about where he'd come from or why. A guy who clearly wasn't used to manual labor was suddenly on a construction site. As the days melted into weeks, Marcus found his assumptions cracking like poorly mixed concrete. Because instead of the resentment and mockery he'd expected to find, he discovered a crew that spoke of Jonathan Williams with something close to reverence. Not the performative kind Marcus knew from corporate boardrooms, but the quiet, bone-deep respect that comes from being truly seen. During lunch breaks, Marcus listened to their stories, how Mr. Williams had personally visited Tommy's father in the hospital after a work injury, paying all medical bills and keeping him on salary during 6 months of recovery, how he'd promoted Rosa to supervisor over candidates with more credentials, but less heart because he'd told her, you make everyone around you better. And that's what leadership is. How he'd sponsored June's entire family's immigration and personally tutored June's daughter in math every Tuesday evening for a year so she could get into engineering school. My little girl, she's at Stanford now, Chen said with tears in his eyes and pride bursting from every word. Because Mr. Williams, he believed in her. He believed in my family. Marcus felt something crack in his chest, a fissure in the narrative he'd built, because these weren't stories of a man performing generosity for cameras and tax breaks. These were intimate acts of kindness that no one was supposed to know about, that his father had never mentioned in their increasingly strained conversations. But Jake remained the outlier, his hostility toward Marcus growing more pointed each day, making comments about college boys slumming it, about people who don't belong, his words carrying an edge that the others noticed and quietly tried to buffer. On the 12th day, as Marcus struggled with a particularly heavy beam, Jake watched with his arms crossed and said loudly enough for everyone to hear, some people are born for this work, and some people should stay behind their desks, where they belong. And Marcus felt anger flare hot and familiar, the confirmation he'd been seeking. But before he could respond, Dale stepped in with quiet authority. Jake, a word, Dale said, and the two men walked away from the crew, their conversation inaudible, but Jake's defensive body language speaking volumes. And when they returned, Jake was silent, but his eyes burned with something darker than before. That evening, as the crew packed up, Marcus found himself alone in the tool shed with Rosa, who looked at him with those all-seeing eyes and said, You carrying something heavy, Marcus Jensen, and it's not construction materials. Her perception startled him, and for a moment he almost broke, almost confessed everything, but instead he just asked, Jake, is he Always like that. Rosa sighed, a sound full of complicated sadness, and sat down on a sawhorse, gesturing for Marcus to do the same. Jake's a good worker, but a hurting man, she began, her voice soft with compassion that Marcus couldn't understand. Why would she defend someone so clearly prejudiced? 5 years ago, Jake was up for a promotion to site supervisor. Thought he had it locked, but Mr. Williams gave it to a younger black man named David, who'd been here half as long. Jake's been bitter ever since, and I won't lie. Some of that bitterness has ugly roots. His daddy raised him with ugly ideas about who deserves what. But here's what Jake doesn't know. What Mr. Williams never told anyone, because he's not the kind of man who needs credit. David got that promotion because Jake was drinking on the job. Had been for months, and Mr. Williams could have fired him. Should have fired him by any company policy. But instead, he got Jake into a treatment program. Paid for it personally. Kept his job waiting. And when Jake came back sober, gave him a second chance, even though Jake had cursed him out in front of the whole crew. Rosa's words landed like physical blows, each one dismantling another piece of Marcus's carefully constructed worldview. Mr. Williams told me once that hurt people, and our job is to see past the hurt to the human. Jake's been sober for years now. Supports his elderly mama and his sister's kids, and he's trying. Even when his old poison thoughts bubble up, Mr. Williams doesn't give up on people, even when they give up on themselves. Marcus sat in stunned silence as Rosa stood, placed a weathered hand on his shoulder, and said, "Whatever you're looking for out here, Marcus Jensen, make sure it's the truth you really want to find, not just the truth that confirms what you already believe." And then she was gone, leaving Marcus alone with the weight of her wisdom and the growing realization that he'd come on this journey for all the wrong reasons. The turning point came on day 19, during a project at an elementary school in the neighborhood where Jonathan had grown up. The same streets he'd walked as a poor kid with holes in his shoes and dreams, too big for the small boxers the world tried to put him in. The crew was renovating the school's crumbling playground, installing new equipment that Jonathan had not only donated, but designed himself with input from child development experts. And Marcus watched as children pressed their faces against the fence, their eyes wide with excitement at the bright colors and possibilities taking shape. During lunch, a young black boy no more than 7 slipped through a gap in the fence and approached the crew with the fearless curiosity of childhood. "Is Mr. Williams here?" the boy asked, his voice high and hopeful. And when Dale gently explained that Mr. Williams was at other meetings but had sent his best crew, the boy's face fell with such pure disappointment that Marcus felt it like a punch to his gut. "He promised he'd teach me to build things," the boy said, and Rosa knelt down to his level, her voice gentle. "You must be Jaden. Mr. Williams talks about you all the time. He said you're going to be an architect someday." The boy's face lit up like the sun breaking through clouds. "He remembers me. He remembers everyone," Rosa said with absolute certainty, and then she spent the next 30 minutes showing Jaden basic carpentry, letting him help measure and hand her tools, treating his contribution with the same respect she'd shown Marcus. And Marcus realized with stunning clarity that this kindness, this seeing of people, this building of more than just structures, this was the culture his father had actually created, and Marcus, in his cynicism and privilege, had been completely blind to it. That night, Marcus sat in his penthouse apartment surrounded by luxury that suddenly felt hollow, and he called his father for the first time in 3 weeks, his hands shaking as the phone rang. Jonathan's voice was warm but tired when he answered. "Marcus, son, I was beginning to worry," and Marcus felt tears burning in his eyes. When had he last cried? As he struggled to find words for the transformation happening inside him. "Dad, I need to tell you something," Marcus began. And then the whole story spilled out. The fake name, the undercover work, the assumptions he'd made, the prejudice he'd expected to find, the anger he'd carried, and the profound shame he now felt at his own blindness. He expected his father to be angry, to feel betrayed, but Jonathan was quiet for a long moment before speaking, and when he did, his voice carried a sadness that broke Marcus's heart. "Son, I knew," Jonathan said simply, and Marcus's world tilted. "You knew? Dale called me your second day. Said we had a young man on site who didn't know which end of a hammer to hold, but had your exact eyes, your exact voice. I told him to let it play out, to treat you like any other worker, because you were searching for something, and I knew if I interfered, you'd never find it." Marcus could barely breathe through the emotion flooding his system. "I came there to catch people disrespecting you, to prove that they didn't appreciate what you'd built. But Dad, I was so wrong. They love Urieli, love you not because of what you pay them, but because of who you are to them." Jonathan's voice was thick with emotion when he replied, "I learned a long time ago that the way you treat people when you have power over them defines your character. Money and success don't mean anything if you haven't built something that makes people's lives better, that sees their humanity, that leaves the world softer than you found it. I wanted that for you, Marcus. Not the business, not the money, but the understanding that we're only as successful as the people we lift up with us." The next morning, Marcus returned to the site with his heart cracked wide open and his eyes finally clear, and he worked with a different purpose, not to expose, but to understand, not to judge, but to connect, and he found himself laughing at Tommy's jokes, listening to Chen's stories about his daughter's engineering classes, asking Rosa about her grandchildren, even approaching Jake during a break with genuine humility. "I know I'm not a natural at this," Marcus said to Jake, gesturing at the construction site, "and I know I probably seem like exactly the kind of guy you can't stand, someone who hasn't earned his place, but I'm trying to learn, and I'd appreciate any wisdom you're willing to share." Jake looked at him with suspicion and surprise warring on his weathered face, and for a moment Marcus thought he'd pushed too hard. But then Jake's shoulders dropped slightly, some of the defensive armor cracking. "You show up every day even though this clearly ain't your world. That counts for something," Jake admitted grudgingly, and then, almost as if the words were pulled out of him against his will, "I'll show you the right way to mix concrete tomorrow. Been watching you do it wrong all week." It wasn't friendship, not yet, but it was a bridge, and Marcus accepted it with gratitude that came from a deeper place than he knew he had. On the final day of his 4th week, Marcus asked Dale to gather the entire crew, saying he had something important to share, and as they assembled in the morning light, curious and slightly concerned, Marcus felt fear and excitement tangling in his chest. "My name isn't Marcus Jensen," he began, his voice steady despite his racing heart. "It's Marcus Williams, and Jonathan Williams is my father." The silence was deafening, faces registering shock, confusion, betrayal, and Marcus pushed forward before he lost his courage. "I came here a month ago with the wrong intentions. I thought I'd find people taking advantage of my father's kindness, mocking him behind his back, not appreciating what he'd built. I was angry and cynical, and so incredibly wrong." His voice broke slightly, but he continued, "Instead, I found a family. I found people who taught me more about integrity, hard work, and genuine kindness in 4 weeks than I learned in 4 years of business school. I found a culture my father built, not with mission statements and corporate policies, but with daily acts of seeing people, valuing people, lifting people up. And I found out that I'd become someone I'm not proud of, someone who looked for the worst in people instead of the best, who let privilege make me blind and judgmental." Tommy was the first to speak, his voice carrying hurt. "So we were like some kind of test, some undercover boss situation?" And Marcus shook his head vehemently. "No, you were my teachers, even though you didn't know it. You showed me what my father has been trying to teach me my whole life. Lessons I was too arrogant to hear from him, but couldn't ignore when I saw them lived out in how you treat each other, how you talk about your work, how you show up every day, not just for a paycheck, but because you're building something that matters." Rosa stepped forward, her intelligent eyes studying Marcus's face, and he met her gaze without flinching. That day in the tool shed, you knew something wasn't right about me, Marcus said to her. You told me to make sure I was looking for the truth, not just confirmation of what I already believed. That changed everything for me. Rosa's stern expression softened. And what truth did you find, Marcus Williams? That my father built something beautiful here, something that can't be measured in profit margins or stock prices. That the people who work here aren't just employees there. The proof that treating people with dignity and genuine care creates something that lasts, and that I have a lot to learn about what really matters. Dale cleared his throat, his gruff voice carrying authority. Mr. Williams, your father, he could have told us who you were, could have made us treat you special, but he let you be just another worker because he trusted us and he wanted you to see us as we really are. That's the kind of man he is. Dale paused, looking around at the assembled crew. Question is, what kind of man are you going to be? Marcus felt the weight of that question settle into his bones. The kind who learns from his mistakes. The kind who listens more than he talks. The kind who works to build what my father started, not just inherit it. He took a deep breath. I'm meeting with my father tonight to discuss changes in the company, not to shake things up or prove myself, but to find ways to do more of what's already working. Better profit sharing, enhanced benefits, education programs for workers' families, and making sure the people on the ground have a real voice in company decisions. But I can't do that without your input, without your honesty about what would actually make a difference in your lives. The crew exchanged glances, the tension slowly transforming into something that might become trust again. And then Jake, of all people, stepped forward. You worked hard this month, didn't complain when the work was brutal. Didn't pull rank even when we didn't know you had rank to pull. You got blisters and sunburn and you kept showing up. Jake's weathered face was serious, but no longer hostile. Your daddy's a good man, best boss I ever had, even when I didn't deserve his faith. If you're half the man he is, you'll do right by this company and the people in it. Coming from Jake, the words carried extra weight, and Marcus nodded, his throat too tight for speech. Tommy broke the heavy moment with his characteristic warmth. So does this mean we can't make fun of you anymore when you hold the hammer wrong? And the crew erupted in laughter that released the tension like a pressure valve. And Marcus laughed too, real and unguarded, feeling lighter than he had in years. Please keep making fun of me. Clearly need the humbling, Marcus said, grinning. And Chen stepped forward, his English carefully pronounced. You are welcome here, Marcus Williams. You learn good. You have good heart. That is what matters. Rosa was the last to approach, and she pulled Marcus into a hug that smelled like sawdust and kindness. Your daddy's been waiting for you to understand, she whispered in his ear. Go to him tonight, not as a boy trying to prove something but as a man who finally sees. That evening, Marcus stood outside his father's office, in the building that bore the Williams name, but this time he wasn't entering as the resentful son who saw nepotism and performance. He was entering as someone who finally understood the weight and responsibility of the legacy his father had built, brick by brick, person by person, kind act by kind act. Jonathan looked up from his desk when Marcus entered, and the hope and love in his father's eyes nearly undid Marcus completely. Dad, Marcus began, his voice shaking with emotion. I spent a month looking for reasons to be angry, looking for proof that people were taking advantage of you, that your kindness was being exploited. But what I actually found was that you built something I didn't even know was possible, a business that actually makes people's lives better, that sees them as humans first and workers second, that operates on the radical idea that success isn't just about profit, but about the positive impact you have on every person you touch. Marcus crossed to his father's desk, no longer afraid of the vulnerability flooding through him. I found out that Dale's daughter is in medical school because you mentored her and wrote a recommendation letter that she says changed her life. I found out that you've been personally teaching an 8-year-old named Jaden about architecture because he reminds you of yourself at that age. I found out that you saved Jake's life by seeing past his worst moments to his potential. I found out that every person on that crew has a story about how you changed their trajectory, not with grand gestures for publicity, but with quiet, consistent acts of seeing people and valuing them. Tears were streaming down Marcus's face now. Years of misplaced anger and cynicism washing away in the flood of understanding. And I realized that the person who didn't appreciate what you built, the person who didn't see your vision, the person who was taking advantage, that was me. I took your name and your success and your position in the company, and I never once asked myself if I was honoring what you actually stand for. I'm so sorry, Dad. I'm so sorry for my blindness, for my arrogance, for wasting years being resentful when I should have been learning from the best man I've ever known. Jonathan stood and came around the desk, and when he pulled Marcus into his arms, it was the first time they'd embraced, and Marcus couldn't remember how long. And in his father's arms, Marcus finally let himself break, let himself grieve for the time wasted and the man he'd failed to be, and let himself hope that it wasn't too late to become someone better. "Son," Jonathan said, his own voice thick with emotion, "I've been waiting for this moment. Not because I needed you to see me as perfect time, far from perfect, but because I needed you to understand that business, money, success, none of it means anything if it doesn't make the world gentler, if it doesn't lift people up, if it doesn't leave every person who crosses your path a little more seen, a little more valued, a little more hopeful than they were before. I built this company because I remembered what it felt like to be invisible, to be dismissed, to have people look right through me like I didn't matter, and I promised myself that if I ever had power, I'd use it to make sure no one who worked with me ever felt that way." Jonathan pulled back to look Marcus in the eyes, his hands on his son's shoulders. "You spent a month learning what I couldn't teach you from this office, that the heart of what we do isn't in the boardroom. It's in the field with people like Dale and Rosa and Tommy and Chen, even struggling souls like Jake. It's in the daily choice to see people, to value them, to build them up. And now that you know that, now that you've lived that, you're ready to lead, not because you're my son, but because you understand what leadership actually is." 3 months later, Marcus stood before the entire company at the annual meeting. No longer the cynical executive who'd looked for the worst, but a transformed man who'd learned to see the best. And he announced the new initiatives he'd developed in partnership with the crew, members who'd taught him everything that mattered, a revolutionary profit-sharing program that made every employee a true stakeholder in the company's success, a family education fund that would send workers' children to college, expanded mental health and wellness support that Jake himself had helped design, and a new leadership development program that would train future managers from within the company ranks, prioritizing character and care over credentials. But more than the programs, Marcus had changed how he showed up, arriving at job sites, not to inspect, but to listen, learning every employee's name and story, making decisions not from spreadsheets alone, but from understanding the real human impact, and slowly rebuilding the relationships he'd neglected during his years of resentful blindness. Tommy had become his closest friend, teaching him about life outside the executive bubble. Rosa had become his mentor, her wisdom guiding him through the complex work of truly ethical leadership. Chen's daughter had started an internship in the engineering department, and Marcus watched his father mentor her with the same care he'd shown so many others. Even Jake had softened, occasionally offering Marcus advice with gruff affection. Their relationship a testament to the power of second chances and genuine effort to change. The construction company continued to grow, not just in revenue, but in reputation as a place that treated people right. And Marcus found a satisfaction in his work that money and status had never provided. The satisfaction of knowing that his decisions made real people's lives tangibly better, that he was building on the legacy his father had started, adding his own chapter not of rebellion, but of continuation and expansion of a vision that he finally understood. On the 1-year anniversary of Marcus's first day on the construction site, the crew threw a surprise celebration, decorating the break area with photos from that month when Marcus had been Marcus Jensen. And as he looked at pictures of himself with blistered hands and sunburned face, struggling with tasks that were now second nature, surrounded by people who'd become family, he felt profound gratitude for his own humbling. Jonathan arrived at the site to join the celebration, and when father and son stood together watching the crew laugh and celebrate, Jonathan said quietly, "I'm proud of you, Marcus, not for running the company well, though you do, but for becoming a man who leads with his heart, who sees people, who understands that our legacy isn't the buildings we construct, but the lives we touch in the process of building them." Marcus looked at his father, at the man who'd built an empire without losing his humanity, who'd stayed soft in a hard world, who'd never given up on his angry, lost son, and he said with absolute certainty, "Everything I'm becoming, everything good in me, I learned from you and from the people you surrounded me with. Thank you for not giving up on me when I'd given up on myself." The celebration continued around them, Tommy's kids running between the construction equipment under watchful eyes, Rosa showing young workers the right technique with the patience of someone who knew teaching was the highest calling, Chen proudly displaying new photos of his daughter's engineering projects, Jake laughing at something Dale said, his face free of the bitterness that had once defined him. And Marcus understood that this, all of this, was what success actually looked like. Not the corner office, or the executive title, or the family name on the building, but the community of people who showed up for each other, who built not just structures, but lives, who proved every day that treating people with dignity and genuine care was not just morally right, but the foundation of everything that truly lasts. As the sun set over the construction site, painting the sky in shades of orange and gold, Marcus stood with his arm around his father's shoulders, surrounded by the crew that had transformed his life, and he made a silent promise to honor this gift he'd been given, the gift of sight, of understanding, of knowing finally what matters, of becoming not just his father's son in name but in spirit, in values, in the daily choice to build a world that sees people, values people, lifts people up, and leaves everyone touched by their work a little more hopeful, a little more seen, a little more certain that they matter. Because in the end, that's the only construction that endures, not the buildings made of steel and stone, but the communities built of kindness, respect, second chances, and the revolutionary act of treating every human being as if their life has meaning. Their story has value, and their presence makes the world better. Because it does. They do. We all do. And that truth, simple and profound, is the foundation of everything worth building.